Okay, good. So let's get started. My name is Joyce Raimondo, and I'm the education coordinator at the Pollock Krasner House and Study Center in East Hampton. Welcome, everyone. And most of you I have met before, but today is a special program. We are going to highlight the achievements of Lee Krasner and other women abstract expressionist artists. So in the United States, March is Women's History Month. I want to hear from you. Why do we need Women's History Month? Women are 50% of the, more than 50% of the population. Why do we need 1 month to celebrate women's history out of 12? Any answers on that?
At least we got a month.
Right.
Well, it's not only in art, but in all areas, you can see that there's literally no acknowledgement of the contributions of women.
Yeah, thank you.
And part of it is this systematic keeping women from having the opportunity to express themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's unfortunate that we need calendars and months and things of this nature to do that, but
yeah. Well, times are changing and we have a long way to go. And it is true that women were, in some cases, deprived of opportunities that men had during their own lifetime. And women who had contributions to the arts and other fields were systematically written out of history. In fact, when I went to college and I graduated in 1983 as an art student, we were given a book called Jansen's History of Art. I'm sure you're familiar with it if you study art. It's this thick, and there was not one woman in the book. It was from the history of the cave days until now, at that time. So they revised the book, realizing that's not right, and they put 9 women in the entire book of the entire history of art. But what I've learned is that the women who were part of this movement of abstract expressionism, they weren't secondary in any way to men. In fact, some of these women actually were responsible for the success of the movement as a whole. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to show you some images of Pollock and Krasner. Then we're going to go into the barn studio. I'm going to take you into the house, and I'm also going to show you other women artists, specifically of abstract expressionism. So I'm going to do a little screen share, and I will ask you some questions from time to time. Oh, wait, hang on, excuse me. Okay, so this is where I'm sitting. I am in the barn studio of Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner. We are located in New York, 100 miles east of New York City on Long Island, in an area that's commonly known as the Hamptons or the East End of Long Island. And specifically, this is an area known as the Springs. So this area attracted artists as early as the Long Island Railroad could take people out here in the late 1800s. Artists started to congregate because it is so spectacularly beautiful here, surrounded by bays and oceans, and very affordable at that time when Pollock and Krasner moved here in 1945. And of course, they had more space. Pollock was painting in this barn instead of a small apartment in New York City. And Lee painted in a small room upstairs, which I will show you later. So I want to hear from you. What is wrong with this picture? This is a picture called the Irascibles. This is of the people of abstract expressionism. And at that time, in 1950, the Metropolitan Museum of Art had an exhibition of modern art. And they left out this really new groundbreaking art, which was really new at the time, abstract expressionism. So the artists got together to rebel, And they wrote the Metropolitan Museum of Art a letter protesting, and Life magazine picked up the story and photographed the artist. So what's wrong with this picture?
There's
Who would like
only
to-
one woman in it.
There's only one woman in it. And of course, there were many women who were active, especially Lee Krasner, Jackson Pollock's wife, Elaine de Kooning, Willem de Kooning's wife, and many others. The one woman pictured here is Grace Hartigan. And Hedda Stern, excuse me. No one knows why she's actually was the only woman who was in this picture. And I have asked the director and she didn't know the answer either. But at any rate, clearly there's a bias in the media, right? Not only are they men, they're all white men. Now, there actually is a story that originally, when someone called the Pollocks and wanted, the letter signed, Lee answered the phone and the person said, "Oh, can I speak to Jackson?" So she passed over the phone. And then later on, she found out that he was calling to have people sign the letter. And she was really mad that she wasn't included because she was very active within this group. So there was really blatant sexism, okay? And of course, there were many women who were accomplished painters, and I will also explain how they influenced the movement as a whole. And they would gather in New York City with the men, exchanging ideas. And I will explain to you how they started out as equals, but then when the big money came along and these artists rose to financial success through the galleries, that is really when the women were shut out. So this book is an excellent book, 9th Street Women, and it highlights 5 of the women artists who I am going to present to you today. Pictured here is Lee Krasner as a young woman. So here's Pollock and Krasner. He's doing his famous drip painting technique in the barn. And he's an abstract expressionist artist, really letting his energy be released through the paint, right? And he's working with non-traditional materials. Jackson Pollock rises as the star of the group of abstract expressionism. But how did he get there? Well, there is Lee, literally in the background. When Lee met Pollock, she decided, and they decided as a couple, that she would put her career on the back burner and focus on making Pollock's painting career a success. She always painted. You might hear stories about how she gave up her painting while she was married. They're not true. She went through a short time where she had a painting block, but it really wasn't because of Pollock. It was just she was working through some creative issues. So, but let's say if a gallery dealer came over, Lee would not say, "Oh, and come and look at my painting too." Lee was such a good businesswoman. Pollock rose to fame and they rose to fortune. Here's Pollock pictured in Life magazine. He was one of the first artists of the group to get national recognition. So when Pollock rose to fame, when Pollock's artworks became worth more, of course, all the artists in the group prices and fame rose, and this was largely due to Lee Krasner. Not aesthetically, I'm talking more business-wise. So here's Peggy Guggenheim, the heiress to the Guggenheim fortune, who used her wealth to support these avant-garde up-and-coming artists. And so you could also trace the success of these artists back to this woman as well. And Peggy Guggenheim gave Pollock a stipend so he wouldn't have to worry about selling his paintings. He had a monthly stipend. She also gave Lee and Pollock, lent them money for the down payment on the house in the spring so they could move from New York City. Now, who negotiated that great deal? It was not Pollock, it was Lee. Pollock he wasn't a businessman. In fact, sometimes Lee would actually kind of coach him on what to say when people were interviewing him. He was very obviously very intelligent, but he didn't have that type of intelligence. There's a really good movie, Peggy Guggenheim, Art Addict. It's a documentary and it has all original footage of her role within this group at that time. So Pollock dies in 1956. He was 44 years old. He was drinking and driving. He was having an affair with a younger woman, and it was Pollock and Edith Metzger and Ruth Kligman were in the car. Ruth was the mistress. Edith was the mistress's friend. Pollock crashed the car right down the street. Lee was in Paris at the time, and Lee comes back from Paris, and after a year, she resumes her creative output in the Barnes studio and remains here for the rest of her life. She's an example of incredible resilience, and she's also a visionary. And here's one of her paintings 1 year after Pollock died. And this is a large painting. It's at the Whitney Museum of American Art. It's a mural-sized painting. And you can see here, Lee is using her entire body as she paints this, right? It has these very sweeping, broad gestures. This is called action painting. And what does action painting mean? Anyone want to speak to that? What do you think action painting is?
Well, it's just literally, I mean, I do this on a obviously smaller, or I try to do this on a smaller scale, but instead of just like painting, if you're standing in front of easel and you're working on a canvas like this, you literally just like take your arm and just kind of go whoosh like that. Or if your canvas is like, maybe if your canvas is on the floor, you're literally like walking around the canvas and doing, so you're not just, it's not just like a hand wrist action, you're using more of your bodily movements to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like Pollock was walking all around the canvas. And Lee also, she did occasionally use a ladder, but mostly she used her body almost like in a dance of paint. And what makes action painting unique also is that the action of the artist is revealed in the final work. It's not disguised, right? You can almost trace back the movement of the artist. And here's Lee's famous technique where she would take old canvases and rip them up or cut them up and reassemble them to create a brand new composition and then paint back into it. This one is called The City. So what is abstract expressionism? All of these artists have a different way of working, right? In Lee's case, she's tearing, she's pasting. It's very physical. It's a release of energy. In Pollock's case, he's dripping. And I'm going to show you the other artists today who happen to be women and all of the innovative techniques that they used as well. So unlike other movements of art, you can't say there's one style, because the whole idea behind abstract expressionism is that you're taking your own individual experiences, your inner life, and you're bringing that forth. And because everybody is so individual and there's not one way of painting, every style looks completely different, okay? Okay, so let's go into the Barnes studio. I am going to take off my shoes and put these slippers on. So I'm gonna mute everybody. Hold on. And please do unmute if you wanna say something. Okay, so when you come here, it's a very intimate look at the studio because we can walk right in after we put these slippers on. We open up to the public in May, and it's only by appointment. So go to pkhouse.org and you can possibly come in person. So today we're not going to focus on Pollock. We're focusing on Lee Krasner. Okay, so after Pollock's death, as I said, Lee came into the studio. So many of the belongings in this studio belong to Lee. So in the first room here, we have these storage racks. And here we have Lee Krasner's painting cart, which you saw in that photo. It's behind glass. And on this side, we have Lee Krasner's supplies. Those are pigments that she powdered pigments you could mix with oil to make paint. And these are mosaic pieces. Lee did make a mosaic mural, and she also made a beautiful round mosaic table. Here we have Lee Krasner's apron, which there's some famous photos of her doing her collages wearing this apron. And of course, this is the now famous barn. And the highlight is Jackson Pollock's floor, where he laid the canvas and walked around the canvas and worked from all four sides, accidentally spilling and dripping paint. And we have historic photos on the wall. The window was installed to let light in. And here we have Pollock's paint. And by the way, Lee and Pollock was supportive of each other's art, as you know, the creative aspect of the art. Lee was much more forthcoming with Pollock. Like one time he said to Lee, is this a painting? Not even is it a good painting? And they had a really good dialogue about art. What I understand is that Pollock was a little more reticent if Lee asked him, like, how is my painting? He wasn't quite as forthcoming of giving feedback, but he was supportive of Lee's art in general, okay? So here's the photo I showed you. And you notice that Lee has her artworks on the wall. She didn't paint on the floor. So in the studio here, we have her strips and splatters, and that's where her paint accidentally went onto the wall. And you could actually match up some of those colors to her paintings if you're familiar with them. And here we have a photo of Lee in action. She's blurry because she's moving, as we discussed. Now, for both Lee and Pollock and all of the abstract expressionist painters, the idea of improvisation and painting as you go along is very important. So what do I mean by that? These artists don't start off with a sketch. They don't have a set plan in mind or an expectation. Lee said, sometimes I start off with a yellow painting and it comes out green. And I don't will the painting, I surrender, right? Same thing with Pollock. He said that the painting has a life of its own, I let it lead. So there's an act of courage in that, not knowing. It's like an adventure. It's not going crazy. These are skilled artists, but it's a letting go, right? You're like a vehicle for expression. You're not the one in control, okay? So how is it that this is Jackson Pollock's floor if Lee was in here all those years after Pollock? Well, the floor was covered while they were both alive. And then after Lee died in 1984, 1987, this becomes a museum. The conservators come in here, take these boards off, take the paper off to reveal Pollock's floor. And that is why this floor was untouched by Lee Krasner when she was working in here, okay? So I'm gonna show you some photos and fill in some of the details of Lee Krasner's life. So Lee Krasner was born in, I'm so bad at, wait, she was 5 years younger. She was born in 1908. And she was the daughter of immigrants. She was the first child born on American soil. Her family came from Russia to escape anti-Semitism. They were Orthodox Jews. And from a very young age, Lee showed an interest in art. Her family expected her to have a traditional life raising children. And in fact, when the sister died, they expected her to raise the sister's kids and marry her husband, her widow. But of course, Lee didn't want any part of that. So she set off to New York City, went to Cooper Union, and she was employed by the WPA, the Federal Art Project. And this was a work relief program that paid artists a weekly wage to make murals. Lee made one mural during that project. She mostly assisted. Pollock was also employed by the WPA. So during that time, the WPA, they paid women and men the same wages. So Lee really didn't experience discrimination early on. Also, the women and the men, you know, they were in New York City. They were these young up and coming artists in the 30s and 40s, and they exchanged ideas, and they were equals in that sense. It was gradually that the women were left out. One story is that when the Surrealist artists came over from Europe, because they were exiled because of Hitler, many of the women said that the Surrealist artists were more sexist than the American men, and that all of a sudden they wanted to meet and have these intellectual discussions with men only, and then let's invite the women in for the party, that kind of thing, okay? Anyway, so how did Lee and Pollock meet? She saw, they were in an exhibit in the Macmillan Gallery, and she saw Pollock's name. She had never heard of him, so she went to his studio, and uninvited, she just found out where he lives, knocked on the door, and they took an instant liking to each other, and Lee thought he was a genius. And so, like I said, together they decided that she would focus on his career. They lived together in New York City. They moved here in 1945 and bought this farmhouse in 1946. Life was good. Pollock was an alcoholic. Lee was aware of that, but he sought medical attention, and he was sober for 2 years, so things were going well. They had 2 dogs, they had pet crows. Lee did not want children. Pollock did. Now, all the women I'm going to show you today, only one had a child. So it's hard today for women to sometimes manage the balance between career and family, but it was almost impossible back then because there was no support system for women. If you had a baby, I mean, this is the 1940s and 50s. What were you expected to do? Anyone want to answer that one? Do you want to unmute?
Yeah, if you were a teacher, you pretty much had to quit your job.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
yeah. Remember there was like reports of women, they weren't even allowed to be shown on television being pregnant. And I mean, it was an either or choice. And historically, many of the great poets, writers, and female artists did not have children, such as Mary Cassatt, George O'Keeffe, and countless others, okay? So life is going well. And as I mentioned, Pollock rises to fame. And, you know, Lee did have an exhibit also. She had one, it was a one-person show, but there was somebody else in the other gallery. But anyway, mostly it was focused on Pollock's success. And Pollock starts drinking. And really that is when life got very difficult for both Lee and Pollock, because he was very irrational and very depressed. He became very, very, very ill. And Lee went to Paris, as I mentioned, and sadly, Pollock died. He was 44 years old. But Lee was extremely resilient because when she came back, she resumed her creative output, and she was, you know, very active in the art world. She was successful in her own lifetime. But I will tell you one thing that Lee did that is remarkable. She took the entire estate of Jackson Pollock that she inherited, And instead of using it towards selfish gain, she created an endowment called the Pollock Krasner Foundation, which is active today, and it gives grants to artists to help them support them financially. So you can go to the Pollock Krasner Foundation and apply for that grant or read more about it. She also arranged that this would become a museum under the auspices of Stony Brook University. And I'm going to show you, she donated the land, much of the land outside, to the Nature Conservancy. So you see all the beautiful animals roaming around out there. And that's because of Lee Krasner. Okay. So
That's incredible.
I know. Yeah,
It's just so wonderful.
it's so wonderful. And look at where we are today in 2022. And, you know, the art lives on.
Yeah.
So that's a visionary. That's a legacy. Right. And so far, we have Peggy Guggenheim supporting these, financially supporting these artists, showing their work. I'm looking for my other shoe. Hold on. Oh, here it is. And we have Lee Krasner, who is a brilliant artist. In order to appreciate her art, I think you need to see it in real life, because those collages and paintings I showed you, they're huge, okay? And they're so textured, like it's like matte and glossy and shiny. So it's hard to appreciate it on a small computer screen. She's a brilliant artist in her own right, okay? And by the way, this is kind of a different subject. But if you research the history of abstract art and you really dig into it, it was always noted that the first abstract artists were Kandinsky, Mondrian, and Malevich in the West. It has recently come out that the first abstract artist was actually Hildolf Klimt, who was working in Sweden, who predated these male artists. So look up Hildolf Klimt. Also, the roots of the philosophy of why artists became abstract artists is a very strong influence. It's called theosophy. And it's outside the scope of this talk. But it was actually a woman, her name was Madame Blavatsky, who traveled the world in search of spiritual meaning and brought these ideas back to the West. These ideas were then picked up by artists who began creating abstract art. So I can't go into the details of that, but you might want to look up, it's fascinating, Madame Blavatsky, or just theosophy, okay? Beautiful day in New York.
Joyce,
Yes.
it's Karen. I studied theosophy and never read anything about her correlation with art. Would you recommend-
Well, that's a whole subject, Karen. I'll send you the recording that I made about it.
I would love it because I've always gone to Quest Bookshop in New York City. And yeah, anything you could send, I would so greatly appreciate. Thank you.
Absolutely. I didn't realize you were on here at the beginning. You must have come a couple of minutes late. I would have been adding a little more detail, but
Oh, it's okay. It's okay.
you came before, so I think you.
I'm
You-
good.
yeah.
I'm good.
And now we're
Thank
going to go into the house.
Thank you.
So here, I'm not sure if the camera's pointed correctly. The barn was originally there and they moved it over here. Pollock and his friends moved it so as to not block this beautiful view. Can you see that? This is Accabonac Creek. That water view goes all the way out to the end of Long Island.
Lower the camera.
Oh, good. How's that?
Good.
All that golden land, that's a marshy area. That is the nature preserve. And of course you could see it's a beautiful sunny day. You could feel the warmth of the sun and the incredible light because we are surrounded by oceans, and that's why so many artists came here. Now, You see this house? This is the old farmhouse. This house had no bathroom or central heat when they moved in. So there was an outhouse on the property, and there were 200 people in the entire area of the Springs. They were fishermen and farmers. It was true rural living. Lee was a Brooklyn city girl. She wasn't used to this rural life with an outhouse and cold, and she had the room upstairs, but sometimes it was too cold up there. So she painted on the ground floor. Now, some women today go, well, didn't she resent that? Pollock got the barn and that kind of thing. No, she didn't resent it because she made a choice and she was happy with her choice at that time. She never expressed a resentment towards helping Pollock with his career, okay? She sometimes.
Well, it wasn't so easy painting out in the barn for
Yes.
like the colder months. So, I mean, yeah, it's, you see pictures, you know, where you see scenes in the movie, he's trying to get like, you know, the heater going in the barn and you've got all this flammable material around, and it's just, well, it wasn't a picnic to paint out in the barn either, so.
No, and also, well, Pollock painted seasonally there, like in the dead of winter, they used to go into New York City more and that kind of thing, because it gets cold here, because it gets very damp, because we are surrounded by water.
Where did he possibly paint New York City?
But, well, when they lived in New York City, they lived in an apartment and he painted. But later on, no, they didn't paint in New York City, like once they moved here. But they did sometimes stay in New York City with friends and go to openings and galleries and things like that.
Obviously, he couldn't do the floor painting in New York City, right?
No, in fact, there's a famous story where before they moved here, Pollock was commissioned by Peggy Guggenheim to make a huge mural for her hallway. And he knocked out a wall in his apartment, which of course is completely illegal. So his family used to help him take the debris in the middle of the night outside so he wouldn't get caught. So they were living in a small apartment, okay? Okay, so I'm gonna continue now. I'm gonna do a little screen share and then I'll take you through the house. Okay, so I wanna present the other female artists. Excuse that phone. Okay, now, this is a very good comparison. This is Helen Frankenthaler, taken for Life magazine by the famous photographer Gordon Parks. And take a look at how she's photographed as an artist compared to Pollock's photo in Life magazine. Okay. So who can tell us, in your opinion, no right or wrong answers, what do you notice here? Besides she's in color.
She has on a very clean pressed skirt, a nice blouse. She's not actually painting. She's posed. No cigarette.
Very proper.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, you don't get the impression that she's an artist actually from that.
Yes, I was going to say she's presented not as an artist, but I guess as a woman.
Mhm. And how might that affect the way you think about women and a woman as an artist?
Not serious.
Mhm. Anybody else?
You can't reconcile the two. You're either a woman or you're an artist.
Mhm.
You can't, I mean,
Can I ask a question for all of the females participating, the women participating? If any of you are on Instagram, of which I am, and follow different artists, I feel like there's almost as much focus on the appearance of the artist and as there is on the art, and I feel oftentimes like it's almost, I don't want to say all the way to sexualized, but it certainly feels very oftentimes a lot of the photos feel very intimate, and I'd say it distracts for me from the art work.
Could it be that's why she in this painting, she's not smiling. She's kind of, I don't know, she has an interesting expression on her face.
She's like,
Yeah.
can we get this over with? You know?
Yeah.
She's not smiling. It's hard to tell if she's being coy or if she's slightly annoyed or if she's just being just a little cute. It's hard to tell, right?
Yeah, and also those photos are often directed.
Oh, absolutely. Gordon Parks is a very famous photographer, and he and himself, you should look him up. He's amazing because he did photos. His range was for life, from like gang members to like the elite to the artists. Like, he's amazing. He knew exactly what he was doing. Right? This is staged. So, but I like to get back to the social media. Can anyone respond to what that gentleman just said? Any thoughts on that from your own experience or anything?
I would like to say something because I am, I'll put it over 50. So, and I've been in the art world for only actually about 15 years now. And I find it very distracting to see a lot of the younger artists. And I don't know if they want us to look at them or their artwork. So for me personally, it is disturbing to watch how their mannerisms and what they do with themselves on social media. Because to me, I take my art very seriously, and it is a profession for me, if you will. And I don't like that they take it more as a light, oh, I'm doing art.
Well, we can't really get into how they take it. You might read it that way, right?
That's the way I'm reading it. This is
That's the way
totally a
you're
personal
interpreting it. Yeah,
observation.
based on
Yeah.
your own opinion. You're interpreting it that they don't present themselves seriously. We don't know if they don't feel serious. We can't really say
Right.
for it. If you don't
I
mind.
agree.
Anybody else? One more person on that one.
Well, I think that, I have noticed those portraits. And I wouldn't say that they're all consistently that way, but I have wondered sometimes when I've looked at them, and I think it's because social media and this quest for likes and this great desire, to have all these hits, and I think that's mixed in there, in that desire to be liked. And maybe maybe in some instances that's an advantage if you're a young and beautiful woman, to get attention. And I guess that's just my thought on it.
I think this is a really interesting discussion because today we have social media as a tool for imagery, and back then we had magazines, right? And so we're really talking about a very similar issue here, right? And this is a theme, right? That men tend to be more credited for their achievements, and women, I suppose still today, often are focus on their appearance. And no matter how successful a woman is, it's hard to get away from that, right? So these are complex. Let's leave this as a question and something to be aware of and something to be observed, right? And even in our own individual lives, how we perceive ourselves, how we present ourselves, and how we treat other people, right? So even in the reading of the book 9th Street Women, it's a very good book. It's amazing. It's written by Mary Gabriel. But a lot of times she will, of course, describe the women's appearances, how they dressed, who they were married to, and so on. Whereas you usually don't get that when you read about a male artist, unless it's some extreme example, like Klimt in Vienna, who was wearing robes, they'll mention it, But other than that, we really don't care how Matisse looked, right?
Right.
We don't care what Monet looked like. Something to think about. But that's not being said. I celebrate women's beauty, right? Women, she's beautiful. We could celebrate that. But we also, of course, as women or just human beings, want to be credited for our insights, our ideas, thoughts, and achievements. So here she is at work, Helen Frankenthal, a very important artist, staining the canvas, unprimed, completely revolutionary. She comes after Pollock. It's called the second generation of New York abstract expressionists. So she's aware of Pollock and fascinated by him, but then she takes this to her own, in her own way, where she's doing these broad bands of color, putting a lot of turpentine into the paint. So it becomes sort of like translucent layers of color that flows around the canvas. Helen Frankenthaler, by the way, she was from the upper society of New York City. And so she was from a very wealthy family, and she broke away from that milieu to become, you know, a young up and coming artist. Her own father was always very supportive of her as a young girl, and her art and her creativity and her intelligence. Sadly, her father died when she was young, and she was derailed as like a teenager. She had a really hard time emotionally. And then she really found her own voice as an artist. And this is one of her famous paintings, Mountains and Sea, oil on unprimed canvas. Now, there was a point in time where some of the men came to Helen Frankenthaler's studio. Mark Rothko was one of them. And after he saw her work, he started making these color field paintings with broad bands of color that were translucent. So you might trace his work back to Helen Frankenthaler's. But when the critic pictured here, Clement Greenberg, later on wrote about color field painting, he didn't mention Helen Frankenthaler. Now, this is a photo of Pollock. I'm going left to right. There's a photo of people on the beach. Jackson Pollock, an unidentified child, Clement Greenberg, Helen, and Lee. Clement and Helen were a couple. Clement Greenberg was the critic who championed the abstract expressionist art, and he was much older than Helen. And you might think that she had an advantage, you know, being his partner. But in fact, as a young woman, she was very clear about it. She did not want anyone to think her success was due to him. So he never gave her any connections in any direct way or promoted her art in any direct way. Other than, of course, she met a lot of other artists and people through him, being in that milieu. And they did part ways, and then she married Robert Motherwell, who was a very important artist. Both of them had a similar background, being from very wealthy families. And their work was very different, but sometimes when people would write about Helen, they would say like he influenced her, but really he didn't. They really had very different work. You can see his work there was much heavier. It sometimes dealt with political subjects, whereas her work was much more personal and lyrical and much lighter in feeling. I haven't read this book yet, but this is an important book that just came out, Fierce Poise, Helen Frankenthaler, and you can get this at any library or on Amazon.
It's a great book. I own it. It's wonderful.
Okay, I know. I can't wait to read it. I'm still working on 9th Street Women because it's so long. And sometimes I can't sleep when I read the book because it's set like around World War II. I get like bad dreams. Anyway, so this is a great photo of Elaine and Willem de Kooning. De Kooning's painting, Willem de Kooning's painting is in the background. So here's another example. Elaine de Kooning was instrumental in the success of abstract expressionism. She was an artist as well. But her role, a lot of times the wives of these artists were expected to work while the man could paint. So to bring in money, she began writing. She became an art critic for Art News. And she had a very special way of writing about artists where it was like an intimate look. She would go visit their studios, and really you could get inside the artist's process, which was very helpful because this art was hard to understand. It was so new. So she was really very important in this movement. She's also an amazing artist in her own right. Now, a little bit about their marriage. They both had affairs, but they did separate. They never fully divorced. And they became very close again at the end of their lives, living out here in the Springs, but living separately. Here's a portrait. Elaine rather, even though she was part of the abstract group, she was a figurative painter as well as abstract. Here's an example of her portrait of de Kooning. And here's an abstract work called Bullfight. So what are we getting at with abstract expressionism? What does this have to do with a bullfight? Where's the bull? What is this expressing in your opinion? Now, I'll give a little description, but then I want you to interpret. What we have here is you see mostly straight lines of brushstrokes that seem to go in various directions, diagonal, vertical, horizontal. We have very bright colors, oranges and reds and yellows, contrasting, a high contrast with dark greens and blacks. What do you make of this? What's the feeling? What's going on here?
Like, I mean, it's energy, it's violence, it's power.
It's aggressive.
Yeah. So these artists, they're painting the energy behind nature in a way, or inside nature. They're not painting an observed scene, right? They're not painting something you can actually see. They're painting, Pollock used to call it energy made visible. They're painting the forces of energy within. And also, partly you could observe movement, but they're not painting an object. They're painting movement and energy and emotion itself. Does that make sense? And later on,
I could see, oh, I'm sorry.
sure.
I can, looking at it, what's interesting is I totally see the bull and the ring and the bullfight. Like with the title, I can see it. Without it, I don't know what I would have seen without the title. So I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah. Now that you mention it, I see what you mean. Oh
Me,
yeah, those black lines look like a bull. You're right.
right? And so oftentimes so I paint mostly abstract, and I will ask people, what do you see? And I'll use that oftentimes to create the title. Because oftentimes what people see is not what I see. So it's interesting how that title is actually it informed, like, oh yeah, I see the bull. I see the I don't know what the right term is. Is it the bullfighter? What's the name of the person that's trying to
The matador.
the matador? I see the matador.
Now that you mention it, the black lines seem to form the shape of a bull. So yeah, so this actually could be an example of an artwork that hinges between abstraction and observation, right? It's sort of springboarding from observation. But even with that, it's the feeling, it's the charging bull, the energy of the bull, right? It's not like the details.
Right.
But good point. Thank you for that. Now I could see this painting in a completely different way. Okay, so here's Elaine de Kooning's JFK portrait. And here she is in her studio in East Hampton. Pollock, her husband, had a separate studio, separate living quarters. They were apart at that point. And this is in the National Portrait Gallery. And this is her state-of-the-art studio. She was very successful towards the end of her life. Now, Grace Hardigan, pictured here. Can someone read that quote?
I didn't choose painting, it chose me.
Yeah, Grace Hardigan, she was from a very conventional suburban life in New Jersey. And, so she was expected to have, marry, have children and so on. And that's exactly what she did. And she had a baby. She was very young. She was 19 years old, married. And her husband suggested that she take a drawing course for fun. And that's how she discovered that she was an artist. And so she embarked on a life as an artist. She left her marriage, moved to New York City, and forged her way as an artist, really unbelievably bold, right? With no prior experience. And sadly, she did give up her child. At first, the grandparents were taking care of the child, and she would see the child on the weekends and that kind of thing. And then eventually she did just completely give up custody of the child. She just felt that she couldn't be an artist and have a child at the same time. And it's heartbreaking when you read the story, of course, if you ever have had a child or you have been a child, right? You realize that's really a difficult thing for a child, but that was her path. And she did become successful. This is examples of her abstract expressionist painting. And you could see here, these are very vibrant colors, right? The reds against the green, those are opposite colors. So they make each color becomes more vibrant next to each other. And then you have oranges, you have in her canvases, these broad brush strokes with paint dripping downward, right? So it's a very expressive use of color and paint. And here we have Joan Mitchell, pictured amongst her artwork, also a rather passive pose. She's sitting, similar to the Helen Frankenthaler photo. Joan Mitchell was from a very wealthy family in Chicago. And sadly, when she was born, her father wanted a boy, and he made that known to her for the rest of her life. And he pushed her really, really hard. He was very critical of her. So of course, therefore, she really pushed herself really hard. And she was studied to be a figure skater when she was in high school. And she was on the path of becoming a champion skater, but she had an accident. So she wasn't able to continue that. But I think it's interesting. I can kind of see movement of that aspect of being a figure skater in some of her artworks. So she embarked on a career in the arts, left her high society life, moved to New York City, married. She apparently would walk around in these kind of clothes, which was really unusual for that time, right? In the 50s, dressing more like a man with jeans and a shirt. She was tough. She used to curse a lot. She used to get angry at people a lot. And she didn't make it known that she was like super wealthy. But anyway, she was really bold in her approach to art and made these beautiful paintings that what's the word for it? They speak to nature, speak about nature, but without being literal. So this one is Hudson River. What is it called? I can't see the label. What is the label down there? Somebody's Hudson River Day or something?
Hudson River Day Line, 1955.
Thank you. So yeah, so you see the blues, you see the golden yellows, you see the paint swirling and dripping down, and some of it is translucent, some of it is thick. You see her brush strokes, you see the mark of the artist. Now, she was influenced by Monet and Van Gogh. And in particular, Van Gogh uses these colors often, this very rich blue and the golden yellow. And eventually Joan moved to France, where she remained for the rest of her life. So all of these female artists, they had some success in their own lifetime, but I'll give you examples of how these female artists are undermined. For years, I worked at the Museum of Modern Art in the 90s, and they had a huge collection of art that's not shown, of course. It's in storage. And many of the women that they collected were just in storage. They weren't in the main gallery. So if you walk through the permanent collection, who would you see? You would see Van Gogh, Starry Night, Chagall, Rousseau, Picasso, and so on. Well, they had one painting of Joan Mitchell. Where do you think it was? It was in the hallway next to the coat check. And I always remember that. I love that painting, but I'm going to be honest with you. I didn't give it a second thought. The reason I didn't give it a second thought is because that's how I was taught. I was taught that the women weren't as important as the men. So it didn't even occur to me, right? So today, when you go to the Museum of Modern Art or the Met, it's 2022, you will see the galleries filled with many of these women and people of color who were left out before. So the story also is not as kind of simplistic and linear as they used to make it. This is Hedda Stern, who made the, who was in the photo. And she used to use spray paint. And many of these artists use, like Pollock, use these unconventional tools and techniques using non-art material, right? She's also an action painter. You could see her action, you could trace it back. Hedda Stern said that she regretted being in that photo because for the rest of her life, the only thing people ever remembered about her was that she was the only woman in that photo. And here's another example of her art. And I'm sorry, some of these aren't labeled. I just didn't have time. And here are other examples of women who happen to be, I mean, artists who happen to be women. So all of these women, they really wouldn't have been happy being categorized as female artists. They were like, you know, Lee said, I'm an artist. I'm not a woman artist, right? And in their own lifetime, unapologetically, men would say, and maybe women said it too, I don't know, I wasn't there, but men would be quoted as literally saying, there's no way a woman could be as good of a painter as a man. And if you went to a gallery, it would unapologetically perhaps be told, I'm sorry, I can't show your work, you're a woman, right? So I hope this makes you want to learn more. And I would this is amazing. I would recommend the book 9th Street Women, Fierce Poise, and the movie, that movie, Art Addict, Peggy Guggenheim is so good. So we're running over a little bit, but I would like to take you quickly through the house. And we do have other tours. Bye, Nicholas. We do have other tours where we go more detailed into the house, but this one, we're not going to focus that much on the objects. But just to give you a little view here, here is the parlor. This house was renovated to the way, here, let me face this way. This is from when Lee lived here, because she remained here until 1984, but many of the books and the belongings, of course, also belong to Pollock. And when you come here and you look at photos, you could see, just like in any house, how the table may have changed and what came later and that kind of thing. This is a temporary exhibit we have here of Picasso. This room would have been used while they were here, like a showcase for Pollock's work. So it's a nice big open space. And Lee would have people over and, you know, make dinner and entertain to promote Pollock's career. That's very similar to women of that era in the 1940s and 50s who would have their corporate husbands, clients over and entertain, right? Of course, they renovated, they put bathrooms in and heat. This is the guest room. Those were their marital beds, the twin beds. But originally those twin beds were in this bedroom where they slept. And later Lee used this room as her own. She's very simple in her sense of design, right? Lee loved nature. You could see her nature collection here, her shells. And she did like to dress up. She dated someone after Pollock, but they weren't serious. She didn't remarry. He has a portrait of Lee by Igor Pontonov, 1932. That's her old boyfriend before she was married, made this portrait. And here is the little room that the very first year Pollock worked out of this room, and then Lee used this for her studio. She also used the garage for a short time and then moved into the barn. And out of this window is this beautiful view. See that? So any questions, any thoughts? Anything that you disagree or agree or want to add?
Another book.
Where's the kitchen?
Another
Okay.
Another book I would love to recommend. It's almost a coffee table-esque book, but it's got great pictures and also great information. It's just called 100 Women Artists, but there's a green line or a colored line through women. So it just reads 100 artists, going back all the way from like the Middle Ages, like Renaissance women painters, all the way up to contemporary artists.
Very good, thank you.
It's wonderful. It's a big old thick thing, but it's got great photos of their work and also great autobiographical information. And pretty much, I'm pretty sure everybody in 9th Street Women is included in the 100 artist books.
I'm
So,
sure they are, because those
Yep.
women are very, very, now they're very famous.
well, and also in this book, Frida Kahlo's in there, Georgia O'Keeffe's in there. I think Grandma Moses is in it. I mean,
Oh,
just-
that's so
yeah,
good.
yeah.
Well, on that note, actually, I'll make an announcement, which is that we do have, this is kind of the kickoff to, we have 4 workshops this month where we study one woman and then we do a project based on their work. So Thursday, that's tomorrow, we're going to do a collage workshop inspired by Lee and look at more of her collages in detail. And go to the website, pkhouse.org. We have Frida Kahlo, Hilda Klimt, and George O'Keeffe are going to be spotlighted. And today we have a fun workshop called Make Your Mark. And I'm going to present artists at 4 o'clock that use unusual techniques. And what do we mean by the artist mark? And then we're going to paint, using your supplies you have at home. Or you can just come and observe. That's 4 o'clock. So check back with that. Any questions?
This was wonderful.
Yes, wonderful as always. Thank you.
It's so nice to be with everybody. And I hope this makes you want to learn more. And to our friend in Japan, Mayomi, I can't believe you got up at 4 in the morning. I mean, let's give a round of applause. That's amazing. So if you ever come here, Mayomi, email me and I'll meet you at the Pollock.
I really want to come to see the house, but because of the COVID-19, it's kind of impossible.
I know.
I had a booster shot the 3rd time, but I'm so afraid of, going. Japanese people are more careful about not getting the COVID-19.
Yeah, well, you're wise. You're wise.
Laura, are we painting in watercolor or acrylic?
You can use any medium you want today. Or today at 4 o'clock. Any material you
Today.
have, bring whatever your preference is. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you.
Don't have paint, you can bring drawing supplies. Okay?
Thank you.
And it's gonna
Thank
be
you,
a lot of
Joyce.
fun. It's gonna be a lot of fun. It's just, you should see what artists paint with.
Oh.
Crazy. Rakes, bodies, you could paint with anything, okay? So anyway, everybody, I mean crazy in a good way. I mean creative. All right, have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you,
Take care.
Joyce.
Thanks
I
for
really
coming.
enjoyed it.
Okay.
Thank you. That's my radiator.